Good afternoon. My name is Andrew Hartnett. I'm the chair of the North American Securities Administrators Association Senior Issues Committee, and I'm also the Deputy Commissioner of the Iowa Insurance Division. Just before we started, I got a scam call, so I'm interested to see if I can get a scam text and a scam email and complete the trifecta before we're finished this afternoon. In more important news, I'm very pleased that you have joined us today. I'd like to welcome you to our special webcast. NASAA's Senior Issues Committee presents Protecting Older Investors from Scams. Please note that this webcast is being recorded. I want to thank, before I go on, NASAA's Senior Committee for their outstanding work in developing this webcast. I do have to run through a little bit of housekeeping, though, before we get started. The views expressed by speakers and panelists on this webcast are their own and do not necessarily represent the views of NASAA, their agencies, or organizations, unless specifically so stated. If your state or province allows you to self-file for continuing education credits, you will find all the CEE information that you need in the Continuing Education tab on NASAA Learning. We want this afternoon's program to be interactive, and all the speakers have agreed to take questions. So if you have questions, please place them in the Q&A at the bottom of your screen. If you have any technical issues or need additional information, please use the chat feature, and NASAA's extraordinary Lonnie Martin will be there to help you. So without any further ado, I am delighted to welcome NASAA President and Nebraska Deputy Director of the Bureau of Securities, Claire McHenry, who will deliver our welcoming remarks, and then we'll do our first interview this afternoon. So, welcome to the program, President McHenry. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you, Andrew, and thank you to everyone who is joining us today. I'm delighted to be here. I'm Claire McHenry, President of the North American Securities Administrators Association, and I want to welcome you to this webinar. For those joining us who are not familiar with our organization, the North American Securities Administrators Association, or NASAA, is made up of state securities regulators in the United States and securities regulators in Canada and Mexico. Our members' priority is protecting investors. Today's discussion continues our years-long effort to focus on the financial exploitation of older Americans. That work happens across the NASAA membership and in every jurisdiction across North America. NASAA looks to its Senior Issues Committee and the Investor Education Section's Senior Outreach Project Group to help guide this work. I know that they, along with NASAA members in every jurisdiction, are constantly evaluating new ideas and approaches to find useful solutions to be implemented by regulators, industry, and by investors and their families. We will hear some of those ideas today. In addition to the work of the committee, we are lucky enough to benefit from the experience and input provided by the members of the Senior Committee's Advisory Council. The council is made up of over 20 experts who work in a variety of disciplines and are committed to fighting financial exploitation. The variety of voices and views on the council point to the fact that combating financial exploitation takes collaboration. No one person, agency, or firm has all the answers and resources to address this ever-growing problem. Whether you are a regulator or law enforcement official looking for new ideas and insights on how to combat financial fraud, a family member concerned with the possibility that a loved one may fall victim to a scammer, or an investor eager to hear about how you might better protect your financial future, I'm confident that today's program will provide you with both helpful information and important resources. I'm happy to be able to start off this webinar with a discussion with our first presenter. Artificial intelligence and machine learning are grabbing headlines and the attention of the financial industry, the public, and regulators alike. While we've seen concerns about AI washing or the use of AI-powered tools by fraudsters, we've also seen the AI and machine learning and the use of AI-powered tools by fraudsters. We've also seen that AI and machine learning have the potential to analyze large sets of data to improve customer experiences, simplify and streamline traditional processes, and even assist with firms' compliance efforts. So I'm pleased to welcome Mike Duff. Mike is the director in the Field Supervision Department of Edward Jones, and one of his responsibilities is the group that handles diminished capacity and senior exploitation matters. We'll be talking about an early stage effort by Edward Jones to use data points of previous fraud victims to predict why clients may be vulnerable to exploitation. Thank you for joining us today, Mike. So
Thanks
my
for
first
having me.
question is, can you tell us about how Edward Jones is using machine learning to protect its clients?
Yeah, absolutely. It's a privilege to be here today. Thank you, Claire, Andrew, the whole Senior Issues Committee. Just really appreciate this webcast series that you've hosted over the years and all the resources that you guys put out. So thank you for the opportunity. I look forward to hearing from the other presenters after we're done. So probably right up front, it's probably best that I kind of help set the stage so you kind of understand like where my comments are coming from as it relates to this machine learning model and this topic. So for those that aren't familiar, Edward Jones Financial Institution with more than 54,000 associates, more than 8 million clients across the U.S. and Canada. So as I talk about our firm's machine learning efforts, I'm mostly going to be talking about like the vantage point of my group as really like the end user, the owner of the output of the model at a large financial institution. And I understand we'll have lots of different groups on this call, and so hopefully you can kind of think about how this might work for you and your group, or how you might possibly even collaborate with others to be able to kind of use data to be able to help inform better decision making. I'm not planning, for those of you that are looking to get into a deep college level analytics course. We're not going to be talking force modeling, F1 scores, Mahalanobis distance. Would not be the subject matter expert on that. Actually, I had to look up some of those terms just to be able to say them as kind of a partial joke. But that's a different webcast. I'm really just going to be talking about kind of how we went about developing our model and what it is that we're trying to do. And so the reality is it's a multi-year, for us anyway, it's a multi-year journey that I don't think we're finished with, right? So it's something that we're continuing to evaluate, monitor, and hope to be able to continue to improve, as we move forward. And then the other thing just to kind of to think about is like, for this conversation, I'm really just going to be talking about this particular model, and not necessarily like analytics altogether as it relates to the things that we are doing at Edward Jones or even within the industry. And so this is really just this particular senior client protection model. So hopefully that frames up kind of my answers to the questions.
That's a good framework, Mike. But let's go ahead and dive a little deeper here. Can you tell us how this model was developed?
Yeah, so I guess we'll zoom up, right? 50,000 foot level, right? So this is senior client protection model is designed using the data from previous victims of exploitation at Edward Jones, and we look to detect kind of the patterns and the characteristics of those clients around the time in which they were exploited, and then built a model using all those different data elements, and then overlay that against current clients and their behaviors and their attributes to try to identify clients at this moment in time that would be potentially involved in some type of exploitation, or that may have some of the same characteristics. Well, I think what I'll do is I'll kind of lay out maybe like the process in 3 different phases. Again, this is the way we developed the model. May look very different for others. There may be more mature, or maybe some of those are just getting started kind of with some of these topics. And so the first part is really in what I call data collection. And so within our group, so again, I'm responsible for our senior client protection team that actually works a lot of these cases. We would store the data around the cases that we were involved in. Obviously, have a narrative as to what actually happened in those cases, but then also having information about the client and that point in time. And so I kind of stress that, because if you look at a whole client's history, if they've been with your firm for a really long time, a lot of times these exploitation matters kind of like reach a point where they something kind of happens, right? And then kind of escalates from there. And so it's important to try to have your data in a manner that an analytics or a data scientist would be able to kind of use that information to be able to build a model off of it. From our analytics friends, they seem to like at least 12 months of data. My understanding is they can make it work with less, and they would love more, right? But at least 12 months of data gives them enough of a data set usually for them to be able to kind of build off of, right? So that's kind of you might call that the pre-work, the data collection process. So then the second phase is the actual model build. This is the heavy lifting, right? You need a lot of people involved in this process. And so my group is involved again as the end user, kind of laying out the use case. What is it that we're even trying to identify, or we're hoping to be able to learn from a model? And who's listening to that conversation are your data scientists, your folks that kind of build your systems, maybe understand your data, where it's housed, your digital support, legal, others. And so you just talk about it, right? You just kind of say, okay, here's what we think. This is what we see. And what we're hoping to find. And so you have to go through some very basic conversations and to understand what you need to define. So like for this model, like what age would we say is a senior, right? I'm not sure we all on this call can agree on that, or even should agree on that, right? But we have to draw a line somewhere as an example. Then we also really talked about what are some things that would likely present a false positive from the model, right? So as we think about clients as they age, are there things that change significantly in their patterns that we can anticipate that is not related to exploitation? So think of things like they reached the max retirement age and they've got to start taking RMDs from their retirement account as an example, right? So those are some of the factors you kind of talk through, and then the data science folks do what I call magic. I'm sure there's another word for it, right? And they take that information, they go and get the data from all the different sources, and then they kind of bring it back together and say, this is what we're going to use. And then they try it out and they say, okay, here are a few clients that would bubble to the top if we were to move forward with a model like this. And so the end users will review that, right, and take a look and say, okay, well, some of the things that we're seeing, it seems like it's presenting, this, but that's really a false positive. And so then there's some iteration back and forth. That can go on quite a few times, and then finally it just kind of clicked. At least it did in this model, just kind of clicked, and it's like, wow, that's really kind of identifying some really interesting situations for us to investigate, right? And so that's really the model build process. And so then once you kind of agree that the model is at a point where you feel like it can be used, that's when you go into the third phase, right, which is to operationalize the model, right? So this would be different at different firms. You got to really kind of get all the stakeholders together and kind of determine how often are you going to run this model. What does the output actually look like? Is it what information is actually presented to the end user for them to be able to understand? How do we educate that end user with that information? And then what do they do with it, right? Here's an account that the model thinks it may be more susceptible to exploitation. So then what, right?
Mm-hmm. So you've been really careful to use the term machine learning instead of artificial intelligence. That seems to be the buzzword of the day. Can you help us understand the distinction and why it's important that you're using machine learning versus artificial intelligence?
Yeah, so that, of course, depends on your definition of AI and artificial intelligence, right? So I think as the industry kind of coalesces around all the different definitions of what really is considered artificial intelligence, like the most specific way that we feel like we can describe this particular model is it's a form of machine learning, right? And so, I like to use analogies, and it just kind of makes my brain be able to understand things a little easier, right? So if Claire, you asked me, hey, Mike, have you been to the Great Wall of China? I truthfully say, yeah, I've been there. Actually, I've been there twice. But the more accurate answer is I've seen about 3 miles of the 13,000-mile structure of the Great Wall. And so I kind of think about it like that, right? So artificial intelligence is this big thing. Almost every conference you go to, everyone's talking about it, right? So means a lot of different things to a lot of different people. And so, I think some, obviously might consider this to be AI, but for now we'll just say like this is just part of a bigger wall that we're trying to build.
And you could have chosen to look at any type of issue when it comes to using machine learning, but you chose, financial exploitation of seniors. What prompted you to start using this technology to detect vulnerable clients?
Yeah. So it's similar to the senior issues committee and NASAA and our regulators, right? We start with wanting to serve and protect our clients and investors, and so as the person responsible for the group that kind of sees these cases day in and day out, like a lot of you on the call, you've just seen the total number of cases, dollars involved, and even just the sophistication, as you hit on earlier, Claire, that I think fraudsters are kind of starting to use a form of AI, machine learning, deep fake technology, right? All these different technologies, and so we thought, why not try to use that for good, right? And so we had some good data. We had a framework here at Edward Jones, and so we thought we could see if we could potentially get ahead of it, right? And to potentially mitigate some of these matters proactively.
And so data, of course, is key to this whole endeavor. What sources of data are being used to train this tool?
Yeah, so this is where obviously lots of different firms will have different opinions on what they can do, and it really depends on the size of your institution or entity. And so you have to decide you're going to use internal data or third-party data, right? So again, ours was built upon existing Edward Jones clients who we knew had previously been exploited, right? We had validated that through from our case investigation. But obviously factors that have to be considered is just kind of your comfort level, with that data. How you can, if you can, validate it, the integrity of it, and whether or not it's going to be, viable for the model to use that information, into the future. And then it's also, kind of important through that operationalizing process is to have some way to be able to kind of look upstream if you're basing this off of data, right? To see if some things are changing within your data. And so those are all kind of ways that we kind of use that information.
And you mentioned that it's good to have about 12 months of data. If good data is needed to start, creating a model. You said you had about 4 years of data, and it's great if everything's already in place, but what do you recommend people do if they don't already have everything in order?
Yeah, so it's a good question. I think it's best to kind of start the conversation, understand what capabilities you have either internally or there may even be vendors that can offer these types of solutions. Understand what your options are, and then just see how it might overlay with your particular institution. And so really feel like each of these things needs to be customized for your particular company. And so that's what I really like in this one is we've built this, for us and the way our business model is set up at Edward Jones.
So I know you're still pretty early in this process, but can you share what you've found so far?
Yeah, so one of the things that you will learn if you get involved in this space, pretty quickly is that this type of, kind of modeling prediction just really at this point doesn't work as a standalone function, right? So it is not that the machine is going to predict and it's going to hit, 100% of the time that there is actual exploitation, right? And so there's still a benefit in having humans kind of take that output, understand a little bit about it, and then go and evaluate the results. And so, even, when the tool, kind of presents and covers, some type of an anomaly, we are going to investigate, right? And if it turns out that we don't find, anything of concern in our investigation, we still think about that as a positive, that there's value that we can be providing for all of these cases. And so maybe, that looks like, an opportunity to talk to the branch staff where that client holds their account, just to kind of heighten their awareness as to, this client and potentially their susceptibility based upon all these factors. It's always an opportunity to talk about trusted contact, right? Does this client have a trusted contact? When did they last update the trusted contact? What is that relationship? And then, to be able to, kind of put in place, some other client protection strategies.
And so you have a lot of regulators on this call who are listening in. Has any of this led to any reports to Adult Protective Services or a state securities regulator?
Yeah, I mean, the model, what I kind of talked about, false positives. Obviously, there are times that it's bringing to light instances where, when we do an investigation and talk, that it kind of uncovers that there really is something there. And so, our process is really kind of the same for all of these. Is we're going to get the account brought to our attention, and we're going to kind of start by kind of gathering information on our own within our compliance group, and then that's when we're going to start to engage others if we think that there's more that we need to look at. So we'll look at the account history. We'll talk to branch staff. We'll talk to clients and trusted contacts. And so there are times, it's sometimes hard to really pinpoint, did we actually prevent something that was about to happen or not, right? That's kind of the difficult parts of prevention work in general, right? So, but you could have a hypothetical example, right, of a client that's been presented for our review, and widow client, right, that has a new live-in caretaker has changed their distribution pattern, right? So those on the call that work these cases, your spidey sense is going up, like, okay, there's something going on there, right? But just because the model presented in those fact patterns, we're gonna dig in a little bit, and if what we find, right, is that the caretaker maybe doing some type of exploitation, we're gonna take the appropriate steps with that, as if we would have gotten it through any other kind of referral. And so that's really the way you want to look at these. Is it's a referral from the system that just kind of goes right in along with the other referrals that you might get from other sources.
So what data points and variables have you found relevant to detecting that someone may be the victim of financial exploitation?
Yeah, good question. So again, I think it's case specific for your institution. There's some obvious ones for those that are are involved in the senior investor protection space, right? So just kind of that age gradient of where somebody's at, marital status, their investor experience, whether they've refused to add a trusted contact, et cetera, right? So those are some of the kind of more obvious data points. But what really I found that I really didn't expect when we started this process is that this model can obviously look at hundreds of different data elements all at one time, and you kind of let the data tell you what it says is the most relevant data point as it looks at previous exploitation cases. And so there were definitely some interesting things that we saw that just otherwise hadn't crossed our minds previously.
So was there anything that surprised you? I mean, to think about it another way is there something that we should be looking for that we haven't considered before? Yeah.
So I keep giving the caveat, right? Specific to each entity and institution, right? But we got regulators on here. We can give caveats, right? Edward Jones, a lot of our branch teams work with clients local in their community, and so there are a lot of phone calls, right? And so one of the most interesting things that we found was we were digging into our data that the call data between clients and their branch team, along with lots of other data elements, but that was actually a data element that kind of presented, and it wasn't just they called more. It might be they called less. It might be that they called for a longer period of time. They might have called for a very shortened period of time. They might have been leaving messages in the middle of the night, right? So some changes in the phone behavior, along with some of the other data elements, was really a high factor to say there's something here that's worth investigating. And so that was the thing that was most shocking. Yeah, I think to me, it just hadn't really crossed our mind previously.
So when we're using AI machine learning, there's often concerns about using bad or biased data, or even the security of the data itself. Has there been anything you've learned during this project about how and what data you collect?
Yeah, so I think firms across the industry are wrestling with this and trying to get the right structure in place to have oversight and governance around these types of technologies. And so having like a data governance process, a data science review board is really a helpful part of the process, right? They're an extra level of scrutiny where they can do peer reviews, they can validate data kind of outside of the data scientist that's closest to that model itself. And then, having that model, and for our instances, go back through that review board multiple times is just an opportunity for them to ask questions, potentially catch, like you mentioned, some type of a bias or something within the data. And then, having a group that is kind of dedicated to monitoring for the term that the data scientists seem to use a lot is like model drift, or significant anomalies where something has really kind of changed. Maybe your business has changed, or it's less predictive of the actual results. And so we may see that as an end user, but again, trying to rely on the data to be able to kind of let us know if something's changed.
So we have a question from the audience, and it goes back to some of the what you discussed about how you developed this model, and it was was the model Excel based, or did you use other software programs? So is this something that you had to develop some significant tools for, or is it something that you could do easily?
So again, here, not being the data scientist, I mean, at the end of the day, part of what we initially saw, the output was Excel, but my understanding is that our firm has some other tools that they were able to use to be able to kind of process. I think there's limitations on kind of just how much data Excel can use and be able to process. So the answer is yes. I forgot how it was phrased, but yes, we used other tools and resources than Excel. But obviously, Excel has a lot of capabilities that you can do a lot with it.
Okay, we just have a few minutes left, but I'd love to touch on, as regulators and compliance people are in this audience, when you're looking at these tools, what are the things that securities regulators should be thinking about, and what kinds of questions should they be asking?
Yeah, it's a good question. I think firms and regulators, we should all be thinking about not being, at least initially, too over reliant on these models, right? And so the way we have thought about this particular model is that it's additive, right? It is something additional for us that we stand up along with all the other components that we have around senior investor protection. And so traditional referrals and things that come in from the branch team. So I think an over reliance, or saying, okay, well, now that we've developed this is the only thing we're going to use. I just would caution, against too early, jumping into that, and again, making sure that you have a human element to be able to process that information, right? And so the analogy, that you may kind of end with, right? So when you're watching Netflix and it's suggesting, you watch this movie, some people may click, right, and just say, yeah, I'm gonna watch it because it suggested it. But your next 3 hours might be better if you read up a little bit on more information and you go and you try to understand, is that really a movie that I'm gonna like? Exact same thing here, right? We're gonna investigate, we're gonna use that information, find value in it, continue to refine and try to get better.
Or you could have children like mine who mess up my algorithm on Netflix.
I know, right?
So, Mike, I just want to say thank you so much for joining us today and for sharing this information about this exciting new project that you have going on at Edward Jones. Thank you. And Andrew, I'll toss it back to you.
Yeah, thank you, Claire and Mike. This was a great conversation, and I appreciate you taking the time to talk to us about it. Really want to see more projects like this. It's important to use our new tools in this way, so really exciting. Next, I want to introduce our next topic, which is approaching victims with empathy. What words work to convince clients they are being scammed or abused? So I'm pleased to welcome Amanda Kelting, the Chief Securities Director at the Minnesota Department of Commerce, and Tara Ambrose, the Vice President and Senior Manager of Client Risk Prevention at RBC Wealth Management. Amanda and Tara, thank you for joining us today.
Thanks so much, Andrew. All right. To get us started here, I've got a whole list of questions, and I'm really excited. Tara and I are both representing Minnesota too. Go SUNY Lee and Reagan Smith from Minnesota. All right, Tara, to get us started, you take the approach of leading with empathy when speaking with a potential victim. What exactly does that mean? And can you give examples of what that looks like versus what it does not look like?
Yeah, for sure. And thanks again for having me on, Andrew and team, and wonderful to speak with you, Amanda. What it means to me is to really apply active listening and to be careful with the words that I use so that I don't, make victims feel re-victimized or so that they don't shut down or feel like they're getting blamed for whatever abuse or scam they're involved in. So it's sometimes even acknowledging the emotion involved or even talking about the emotion, which doesn't necessarily come naturally in financial advisor conversations, especially when it's uncomfortable. And so it's really about placing the blame where it belongs, which is on the criminal or on the abuser, and being able to build trust with them in a way that is helpful and can empower them. It can be things as simple as saying things like, instead of, how much money have you given them? It can be, how much money have they stolen from you, right? They're putting the blame on the scammers or on the abuser. Sometimes I've heard family sometimes reacts the worst. I've heard where family says, Mom, how could you do that? How much money did you lose? Oh, how did you not know that was a scam? How could you fall for that? And I've heard occasionally a financial advisor say, of course it's a scam. Of course everybody knows that's a scam. And we get training on it all the time. Clients don't always. And, I think we forget that sometimes and forget that our clients maybe have already built a strong feeling towards this person or trust them. The other reason I really like to focus on empathy and empowering language too is I was really worried when I started talking to clients directly and getting more involved in these situations. I was worried I was going to say something wrong. These can be very emotionally charged. These scams and abuse can do a lot of damage to mental health. We've seen clients decline very quickly when they've been a victim. So I wanted to just make sure I wasn't doing any more harm. Like I want to feel really good about the interaction that I have. At least I tried my best and that I didn't make it worse, right? So that's my focus on empathy. I think I've learned a lot by just reading a ton. A lot of it is trial and error. And AARP has a fantastic Words Matter program run by Kathy Stokes that's amazing. And so I've learned from her as well.
Awesome. Thank you for those specific examples too. That's really helpful. And I also appreciate the empathy approach because my grandmother was a victim and we met her in that space with empathy. So I can definitely see the value in that. Can you explain a little bit about why coming at it from a straight logic perspective might not work with a potential victim, and explain a little bit about the mindset or the state that the potential victim might be in.
Absolutely. I think, when I did first start this, I didn't have no one told me what words to use. And so when I was doing this, I would approach with logic, and I'd be like, okay, this is a scam. Here's why it's a scam. Here's all the red flags. Here's how it works. And I just sort of talk at them, and give them that logic. But what I realized over time, they're not thinking with logic at this point. They are being coached. They are being coerced. They're being lied to. And the goal of scammers and abusers is to get their victim to act in a highly emotional state. So they're not thinking with logic. They are more reacting to emotion. And we don't know what the storyline is yet most of the time. We know sometimes they've been building that relationship for weeks or months. Sometimes we find out that people think they're in a life or death situation, or they think they're going to get arrested. So while this on the surface might seem, oh, it's a typical scam, like we don't know what's behind that. They could be really scared. They could be getting 50, 60 texts a day that's pressuring them. We've had people think they are part of a government investigation, and they've been coached to set up a cell phone, and they must have it on at all times, or they have it in their pocket while they're talking to people, and they think they're being listened to, and they're being listened to. We have people that are just under tremendous amounts of stress. So, approaching with logic isn't going to get past that. It's going to be a barrier. And so I've also just anecdotally, I have a lot more success. I think it just works a lot better when I try to build that trust first. When I spend the time listening to them, I'm better at being able to get through to them with the logic part. It helps, but I don't think you can only focus on the evidence or the logic.
Mm-hmm. Yep. And obviously, if it was logical, they wouldn't be in that situation in the first place. So
Yeah,
that's a really good approach. And thanks for being open to sharing too, how when you first started, you kind of went in at one angle, but learned over time. So thanks for sharing of where you started at.
I still learn every call. I feel like I learned something new. Oh, that worked. And I take note of that. And
Yep. Absolutely. Can you share a little bit about what have been some of the most successful tactics or phrases that you have used to help kind of disarm a potential victim and get them to really trust you?
Yes. And so I want to go into specific phrases, but before I do that, I want to just point out, if you read a lot about this stuff, it sometimes takes more than one conversation, and it sometimes takes more than one perspective or one person to have the conversation with them. So what I feel lucky about my team at RBC, our financial advisors see the red flags or are talking to the client, getting the request for send me $50,000, but I can't tell you why, from their client. So they're coach, they're trained to bring that to my team. And they often have tried. By the time they bring it to my team, they've tried. They've asked questions, hey, this doesn't seem like you. Tell me what's going on. The client shuts them down, and they come to my team. So having that second level person be able to talk to them beyond the financial advisor or the first line banker or teller, that can actually really be powerful. Just having another person have that conversation. So if firms are in a position to have a compliance person that can be more of an expert on this, or someone else in their branch that's willing to help be this, just having that extra person on the conversation helps. The other thing I learned really quickly is it's really powerful to have both myself and the financial advisor on the call. There's a couple reasons for that. One is context and background can help as well, but it also is really important that the client knows that the financial advisor hears everything I'm saying. So that they can't go back around me and say, well, Tara said this, or kind of the back and forth. And then they just know that, there's some accountability there because the advisor heard everything too, right? And that helps from re-victimization standpoint. So not only being willing to talk to somebody or have that second level person to talk, but the phrasing is really important as well. So one of the most effective techniques I use is to sort of explain my background, that this is what I do every day, and that fraud and scams are an epidemic. And so my goal here is just to help determine if this is legitimate or not, to protect everyone involved. I don't judge. I say things like, it's safe to talk to me. I'm not trying to pry, but I do have an obligation to try to make sure this is legitimate. And I say things like, would you be willing to be detective with me? And we can look at this together from a fresh perspective and just make sure it's no one's trying to take advantage of you. When I use that detective line, or I say, would you be willing to investigate this with me? Most people say yes. They still might be guarded with what they share at first, but I'm a little persistent. Sometimes I won't give up easily, But I also then I also ask them to share. So, I think it's also just a part of listening. So the more I can get them talking, the more they reveal over time.
Yep. And I know you talked a little bit about when we met about a lot of times victims just want to be heard. So with some of your initial approaches, you'd come in and just say, here's why I think this is a scam. But you learned over time that you just need to kind of sit back and let them share their story. Probably too, because they've been holding it in. And I know sometimes there's a lot of shame and guilt. And so just having someone listen to them is probably really helpful.
Important. And it can build trust. Obviously I have heard the advisor's version of it from the game of telephone, but sometimes when I ask the client to just tell me how it started, how did you first start talking to this person? They sometimes will give new information or change their story as well. So it's really important to give them a chance to just explain what's going on. And then you can ask more questions. And the goal there is the more they, rather than me talking at them or telling them I've come to the conclusion this is a scam. And I do usually say that at some point during the call, but the best case scenario is if they start coming to that conclusion themselves as we have that conversation. So some of the things I can ask them that help that further that conversation about the red flags is, have you been told not to talk to anyone? If we haven't already figured that part out, have they told you not to talk to anyone? Have you talked to your family about this? Why not? Have you asked for documentation? Have you asked for questions about to help make sure this is real? And 99% of the time, these clients they've tried to stand up for themselves. They've asked for proof. They've asked for documentation. And I'll kind of put that as a 2-part fast follow question to say, and when you've asked that, have they made you feel bad about asking? And the answer is always yes. And so that's, again, I explained that technique of you have a right. These are legitimate questions you're asking. You're asking, they're putting you in a position that's, jeopardizing your financial security. You have a right to ask for documentation or to know the details. And for them to make you feel bad about it, that's actually like a gaslighting. That's a psychological abuse tactic. So if somebody who really cared about you, they would be willing to answer your questions and give you the documentation. Sometimes when I ask about documentation, they actually have provided, and then I can take a look at it. That helps from the logic evidence perspective when we get to that point where I can point out all the red flags. And so sometimes I give examples, especially when they're not giving me a lot at first. I'll say, when I see this, sometimes I find out it started with a computer pop-up and on your device, and you think your things are thing. And then I said, sometimes then you think they told you your bank account is compromised. And then from there, sometimes people think they're dealing with an investigative department, either a fraud department at their bank, or they think they're dealing with law enforcement. Does any of that sound familiar? And they'll sometimes bite. In the romance scams or friendship scams, when we suspect or they tell us I'm engaged or whatever to this person I met online, sometimes I can play those out pretty long too and tell them what to expect next, or kind of say, when you've asked this is usually what happens next. And then sometimes they're like, yeah, that has happened. The lottery scams, I can explain to them why they always say it's a car, why the money's always coming from overseas, and it's because it creates all these stopping points to ask for more money. So I kind of go through that, and the more I can get them talking, it actually gives me more ammunition, and not ammunition, but like talking points to combat those lies that the scammers have told them.
Yeah, absolutely. That validation must really go a long way to help kind of build that trust, which can then lead you into hopefully a space where you can make recommendations for them on what to do next. So can you share a little bit about what some of those recommendations might be and what you actually see them doing in the end?
So sometimes, it's unclear whether the person has really fully come to terms with the fact that they're being scammed, especially. So sometimes I'll ask them, how are you feeling about things? And I'll say things like, I would really like to keep your money safe here. Can we pause this for a few days and take a break from this? Let's think about it. And a lot of times they'll give me permission. Now we still have avenues to use a hold, whether they give us permission or not. But sometimes I try to get their buy-in, and I'll say things like, how about we check in next week? How about we sit tight for there? But I always tell them to cut off contact, take a break from this person you're talking to. They're gonna, and I set expectations, like they're gonna panic and they're gonna try to call you even more. If you do pick up, they're gonna claim some major emergency has happened, or they're gonna get mad at you. So the biggest thing I stress for, is even if you're not sure if it's a scam right now or you're being abused, cut off contact. Try to just take a break from it. See if you can talk to someone. Is there someone you trust that you can talk to about it? You don't have to give the details of everything, but just like say, hey, I feel like I might be targeted by a scammer. And you'll be surprised at how many people have had similar experiences. So talking about it with someone you trust. And the second thing is I usually set a follow-up and I'll say, so, I want you to file an FBI report, or I want you to do call the AARP helpline, or I want you to file an FTC report. And then I always say, we're going to check in with you next week and see if you've had any, see if you've been able to do that. So I kind of set an expectation that I want them to do those things and that we're going to follow up. And so if I realized when I would leave it sort of open-ended, clients got overwhelmed with what to do next, or again, they picked up the phone and started talking to the things. So when they know we're sort of going to hold them accountable, that follow-up is also something to look forward to. So when I talk about these clients being scammed or talking to their scammers 40, 50 times a day, oftentimes, even when it's negative, that's filling someone's life. That's going to give them focus and attention. They may not have any other human interaction going on right now. So that void is hard to fill. And so even as simple as we care about you, we're going to follow up next week, can help somebody stay strong and not pick up that phone from the fraudster again. So, we try to set up ask our financial advisors to follow up and kind of keep an open conversation going. We might say things like, we recommend, we really want you to talk to your family about this, or, do these things. We created a guide for RBC that's on our website that is a fraud and scam recovery guide, because there was literally so many steps, especially if they compromised their credentials or had, mail things, something associated with it. So there's like a step of who to report it to, general steps about securing your online information as well. We are seeing more of that, where scammers are actually convincing clients to log on while they're on their computer, or give their credentials, or so that it's not only just a scam, but now they've also compromised their online access, those types of things. So having a guide, having a checklist, or sending them to a place that can walk them through it, like one of the helplines, either the FINRA helpline, the DOJ senior fraud line, or AARP is a great resource as well, that will help walk them through those steps, because sometimes they need a little bit of handholding.
Yep. And I really like that idea of the follow-up call. We've all gone through something emotional, and then you hang up the call and your thoughts go a million miles a minute and you want to talk about it with somebody again. So that's really nice that you do that follow-up call, so that they have kind of another area to ask questions and also be held accountable to doing some of those steps. So that's great.
And I don't always have time to do the call, but I ask the advisor to.
Yeah. Awesome. You talked a little bit about kind of the advisor's role throughout this conversation here. Can you talk a little bit about how you train and coach advisors to recognize these red flags and then be willing to escalate them to your team?
So the first thing, I think, the industry's done a good job, and I think there's probably every firm has some training on red flags of what that looks like, whether from an AML perspective or a vulnerable client perspective. I think sometimes people, where they are getting stuck is, how do I question a client that I don't think they even have any impairment? I'm not worried about them with cognitive issues. Can I even ask, do I have a right to ask them what they're using the money for? How do I do it? And then also just recognizing, I think, until it happens to them, they don't realize their clients will lie to their face, right? They think they have this strong relationship. They're not realizing that the clients will lie to them if they're being coached or in one of these scams, or they feel embarrassed, things like that. So one of the really simple techniques that I focused on the last couple of years is getting advisors comfortable with asking two questions. What's the money for? And are you going to need more money in the near future? So anytime anytime there's an atypical withdrawal, something that they don't normally come for, $10,000, something that's just out of the blue for them, that doesn't seem like normal business. Ask them, just so I remember down the road, what is this for? In case you and I forget what we took this money out for, I'm just going to take a note of it. And then let's look at your liquidity. Do you think you're going to need any more funds in the near future? I just want to make sure we're planning appropriately. And what that does is that we see patterns, like Mike was talking about. There's sometimes patterns, especially with scams. And we know that a lot of scammers will come back for equal or greater amounts, anecdotally we know, for equal or greater amounts within 2 weeks. That's what I see on my team. And we're a smaller sample size. We're a smaller firm. But than Edward Jones. But we see a 2-week pattern pretty regularly with scams, 2 weeks or less, where they're going to come back. So when you ask that question, do you think you're going to need any more money? The clients often don't, because they think that money's coming back. They think this is the end of it. So they'll say no. And then they come back, and that actually sets up a really good way to have that intervention conversation about, a couple weeks ago you took out 10,000. Now you're asking for 20. You didn't think you were going to need any more for the rest of the year. So this concerns me. This looks like a pattern we see with scams and fraud, and that sets up the conversation really well. And as far as like getting the advisor's trust with my team, again, we've been really lucky to be able to focus on that. It really was showing them that I'll take a hands-on approach, being really responsive, giving them talking points with what words to say. They love that because they don't know how to have these conversations, or they're not comfortable having these conversations. So being willing to guide them through this, do a little bit of hand-holding, some follow-up, and showing that it's worth it to try. We're not always successful, but it's worth it to try. And it certainly covers us from a perspective, not regulatory, but dispute perspective as well. It's like, we really tried. Like we had this big conversation. We provided all these resources, document it really well. And we'll take other steps as needed or required, like getting adult protective services or the state involved, or, using a hold or things like that too. But I think this intervention conversation is one of the most effective tools, because we know that not every client's going to meet the criteria for one of the state agencies to get involved. Right? So if we don't try, no one else may not. So they might just be stuck out there. And then what are we going to do? The problem doesn't go away.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think too, I mean, I don't know, maybe like 10 years ago, advisors might have been a little bit more protective of that relationship and like be a little leery to like bring in another person. But I think now that we're all getting these text messages, and Andrew just talked about getting one in this meeting, I mean, we're all experiencing it probably once a week. So it is just so much more prevalent, I feel like. And so maybe advisors are more willing to kind of open up.
And the only other thing I would mention on that too, no offense to any compliance people on the calls too, but I think it helps. We're not part of compliance. We're part of a risk department. So I think sometimes advisors are a little more hesitant they don't want to get compliance involved, right?
Yep.
But we're kind of an independent function. Our goal is to reduce risk for them, for the clients, for RBC as a whole. And that built a little bit of trust too. So that this function that I do now, it used to be in compliance, and they specifically moved it out of compliance to focus on how can we grow this initiative? How can we get the field more willing to engage with us? And that was part of it.
Yeah, that's a good point. So being a regulator myself, I threw in this question at the end about do you have ideas or thoughts on how regulators can help you and help address these types of issues? Do you have any wild and crazy ideas that regulators could consider to help protect against this?
So I can just say every state is different. Minnesota is one of the ones that I love when I get a case, not love, but I love that I have the resources at hand, because not every state has a commerce department that will take and actually talk to the client. A lot of times the requirements to report, or the avenues for which we report, are adult protective services, law enforcement, or securities division. And oftentimes the securities division is focused on what is the firm doing? Is the firm doing it right? That's my perspective. But some states have agencies within their securities division or within other avenues of government where they will do an independent investigation. So the person doesn't have to be impaired, doesn't have to meet the criteria of adult protective services, and they will see if they can help. And that to me is the most effective, because there are plenty of times when we've tried, we can't get through to the client. They don't meet criteria for adult protective services. Sometimes we can call law enforcement, and they'll say, well, we don't have resources, or, I can file a report. They can file a report if they're ready, but they're not going to spend the time to go out and try to help convince somebody they're a victim of a scam. So I think, the more you can have dedicated resources within the securities division that really understands the complexities of these issues and is willing to maybe even get involved more directly, I think it's worthwhile. It's another layer of protection that can help. The only other thought I had to your question was centralized reporting. For firms that do business all over the country, it is, Mike can tell you this too, it's extremely time consuming and resource intensive and frustrating to have different reporting mechanisms and capabilities in every different state. So there is a centralized reporting portal called Helpful that is run by EverSafe. It's amazing that partnered with SIFMA to get a government grant to start it. We use it. It's simplifies reporting. It also provides an avenue for passing secure information back and forth, which we struggle with sometimes with agencies. So that would be my only other idea.
Awesome. Thanks for sharing that.
Mhm.
We did get one question. So it's kind of all over, could go throughout this whole thing. So
Mhm.
in speaking with a victim, how do you deal with potential caretaker fraud? Can you share an example or how you might
Yeah,
approach
so
that?
oftentimes we do talk to the client if they're still able, if they have capacity to have a conversation with us. We'll look and see if there's a trusted contact and engage them to see if they can help. We do often report those because we don't know that caretaker could be doing it to multiple victims, right? So if we see evidence or suspect that, we do often report those to state agencies to see if they want to investigate it as well. We can sometimes set expectations or, again, ask about future things. A lot of it's really hard when it's the undue influence because the person who's receiving the care, the client, they might say, oh, but I want them to have that money, right? They do a lot for me.
Yeah.
So those are really hard cases. And so I think it's working through step by step, what is maybe even going over with the client, how much money over time, because sometimes they don't realize how it's adding up, right? And then just setting about expectations. So how much do you want to be able to give them as a bonus? Like, let's set up automatic payments so that they're not writing checks all the time, or let's set things up so that the checkbook isn't laying around, or do a prepaid debit card. Sometimes ideally we want a power of attorney or someone with a fiduciary responsibility overseeing their expenses. Obviously that can't be the financial advisor unless it's a family member, but so we really do try to get a fiduciary in place to have that oversight over the caregiver, over their day-to-day finances. When that's not possible, again, we try to look and see if there's a professional type nonprofit that could take that role, or get social services involved to see if they have ideas with it as well. But it's sort of happy to talk offline too, but I think it's one of the harder ones because there's that power dynamic of they depend on the caretaker, so they're not going to say no, and they want to give them, they want to reward them, or they want them to have that money, and that gets really hard.
Yeah, sounds a bit trickier there. Well, that concludes our session. A+ getting through all the questions. So thanks so much, Tara. Appreciate it.
There will be a survey at the end. You don't have to, give yourself a grade there, but
too late. I already did, Andrew.
Yeah, I know. That's a page out of my book. I often do that. So Lonnie's posting for anybody who's doing CE 774394 is the code if you're going to do your own CE. Tara, Amanda, thank you. I've always found that topic to be such a useful one because naturally I want to approach it from the logical perspective of, this is a scam, and some of those examples of, ask about the future cash needs. Will you be a detective with me? I think some of those are so, such a great way to get around that, the 50 texts a day, or to sort of break down some of those barriers. So I really appreciate you guys walking through that and sharing it. And now we are on to our third and final topic for today, talking about the Stop Senior Scams Act and the advisory group that the FTC set up, the Scams Against Older Adults Advisory Group. So I'm excited to welcome Patty Hsu, the coordinator for the Stop Senior Scams Act in the Division of Marketing Practices at the Federal Trade Commission. So Patty, thank you for joining us. All right,
thanks for having me.
So the FTC launched the advisory group, the Scams Against Older Adults Advisory Group in 2022. When I was writing it, I was thinking in partial response to the Stop Senior Scams Act, and I'll let you sort of talk about that. But so the advisory group divided its work into 4 work streams, 4 committees. And I thought we'd start with consumer education and outreach. That's usually where people start when we talk about scams, right? If we could just teach people not to recognize that it's a scam, then we'll solve this problem. So what were the committee's goals? How did it organize its work? What were the results of the work?
Sure. So just to give people a little bit of context, 'cause I'm not entirely sure how familiar people are with the work that our advisory group was doing. But as you mentioned, we did form it in 2022 in partial response to the Stop Senior Scams Act that Congress passed in March of that year. And we did divide up our workflow into 4 different committees, and the first one is consumer education and outreach. But before we sort of talk more in depth about that particular committee, just to mention really briefly what I know we're going to talk about in more depth at a later time, but the other 3 committees are industry training, technology, and research. And the reason I wanted to mention them is because, you know, we sort of approach this from a more holistic standpoint, that there needs to be like a lot of different ways that we can sort of approach scam prevention. And so, as you said, you know, consumer outreach and education is one of the areas that people most commonly think of when they're thinking about scam prevention. So we did sort of take that on, but it was in context with the other 3 committees. So with that in mind, this particular committee was really looking at how to expand existing consumer education outreach efforts. And if you looked at the Stop Senior Scams Act, you'll notice that the Congress basically told us to include a lot of different industries within the advisory group and in the work that we're doing. So we had to think about how could we provide some guidance that's going to cross industries, cross entities, cross, you know, a lot of different sort of variations, if you would. So what we were really trying to do was provide guiding principles that can be used regardless of what kind of organization you are. Are you government? Are you consumer advocacy? Are you an industry member? Are you just an advocate, right, that's trying to do consumer education? And the goal was to try to identify what are the guiding principles that people should be incorporating into their consumer education and outreach efforts. And they put together this, the guiding principles for this through 2 different methods. We had the committee split up into 2 different groups. One was the guiding principles subcommittee, is what they call themselves. And they really took like a retrospective approach. They looked at past consumer education outreach campaigns to figure out what worked, what didn't work, lessons learned, trying to distill out the key sort of takeaways. And then we had the other part of the committee, which is we called the outreach subcommittee. They did something a little bit different. They actually went ahead and did pilot programs where they actually tested different methods of getting messaging out there. And so from the pilot programs, they also sort of distilled out what worked, what didn't work, et cetera. And basically that committee took those 2 different approaches and distilled it into what we call the guiding principles that really outline sort of the key takeaways that anybody who's doing consumer education and outreach should be thinking about and incorporating into their own education efforts. I'm assuming you're going to want to know what the key takeaways were that we came up with. These are things I think that if you've been involved in consumer education and outreach, you're probably not going to be surprised by, but the devil's are always in the details, right? So the first is going to be know your audience, right? Older adults, and I should say a lot of this effort was looking at communicating specifically with older adults. So as you know, like older adults are a very diverse group. They're not all the same. They come with a whole wide variety of experiences and expertise in education and knowledge. So you really have to know really specifically what audience you're trying to reach and what the messaging is that you're trying to reach them with. And so that could be consider different learning styles, different cultures, different language that you should be using, what the lived experience is that might actually be useful to that particular audience. The other key thing is who's the messenger? We really sort of understood that the messenger plays a key role in how effective the messaging is. So that could be things like, working with libraries, working with local ethnic media, working with public safety organizations, trusted peers, affinity groups, even places of worship, right? So you have to kind of think through who are you trying to reach and what's the right vehicle to reach them with. The other thing to really keep in mind, and this is actually dovetails really nicely with some of the lessons and information that Tara was talking about, is really trying to focus on using empowering language and use plain language as well. And make sure that the language is actionable, because that is really what sort of resonates and what works in terms of consumer education messaging. And then you have to think about, does the design of your messaging sort of support all those considerations. So for example, if you're trying to use empowering language, make sure it's plain language that's actionable, that people can actually, take and do something with. Don't use shaming language, language that places the blame on the consumer or the older adult, or language that sort of scolds. Tone really matters. And using that kind of language is just a real turnoff. It's not really effective. The other thing too is when you're thinking about the design, you need to think about, how are you actually designing it to make it plain language so people can actually read it and understand it. So things like font size really matters. High contrast colors. One of the things my takeaway was, yellow is apparently a terrible color. Never use yellow in any of your consumer education messaging for older adults. Think about—
That's hilarious because I'm looking at the things and it's got yellow all over it. But anyway, go on. I'm sorry.
Things like white space, to language, right? So how are you presenting it? Are you presenting it in a big block of text or bullet points? Things that might be a little bit easier to read. So those are kind of the design elements that we're really encouraging people to think about. And then really the last is to really seek feedback. So when you're thinking about the messaging, you need to think about testing the messaging, testing the delivery method, see what works, what doesn't work. It could be informal, it could be formal. You could try to get feedback by doing questionnaires after a presentation, for example. You could do informal focus groups, but just try to get a little bit of feedback on what's working and what doesn't work. So those were the key takeaways from our consumer education group. And I should say, I forgot to mention this, we did utilize some of the research outcomes and incorporated that into the guiding principles for consumer education.
Right. I forgot to mention too, that's one of the two committees you created that NASAA had a representative on. We're going to get now to the other one, which is involved training industry. This is something that we've long tried to make a priority, right? That training industry is important. Some states have included mandates in their versions of the NASAA Model Act. NASAA supported the Senior Safe Act that encourages training across the financial services industry. What came out of the industry training committee?
Yeah, no, thanks for the question. And I should say, the FTC is not a financial regulator. So for us, a lot of the information that we were learning from industry players and other regulators was, at least for me, was new to me. And it really did learn a lot about how much NASA has been involved in. All of the regulators in the security space have really been involved at the forefront of these areas for a very long time. So we are definitely sort of leaning on the lessons learned and the things that you guys have all been already working on for many years. So on industry training, and if you look at the Soft Senior Scans Act, you'll actually see that this was the main focus of the act. And it was really sort of focusing on how can industry do more to train their employees to intercede when a consumer is in the midst of a scam. And again, if you look at the industries involved, there are a lot of different industries involved in our committee work. So, we have like different payment sectors involved. So we have, broker dealers, we have banks, we have crypto companies, we had gift card companies, we had retailers, et cetera. And one of the key takeaways that we sort of learned was every industry is going to have a different approach because the relationship with the client's really different, the relationship with the customer is really different, the environment's really different. So we did put together guiding principles that we are hoping can translate across all of those different sort of areas. So I would say the key takeaways for our industry training group, we did come up with 4 guiding principles of what people should be considering for training. One of the more important ones I would say is actually getting corporate support or leadership support, I should say. Having leadership support and the tone from the top really matters because that sort of helps dictate things like prioritizing time and resources for training. It really needs to be kind of embedded into the corporate culture and into the brand. And some industries do a better job of it than others, and there's a variety of factors for that. But our committee did talk a lot about how do you actually get leadership support. But I would say that's one of the key takeaways. Another one is really think about the impact that the training is going to have. So think about the content, the method, the frequency with which you're providing the training. Every industry has a whole variety of trainings we have to do. Some of it are regulatory required and others are not. So every industry is going to have to figure out what works for them and what works for their particular industry. So for example, a retailer is going to have very different training requirements for their retail clerk than a broker dealer would, where the relationship and the sort of issues are just really different. But think about those kinds of issues, and then also similar to consumer education, really think about the plain language and the variety of learning styles that should be incorporated. And one of the things that we really sort of learned as we were going through this process is, don't overly lawyer the training. Don't, incorporate all that legal jargon into the training. And so really try to think about like who you're trying to reach. Also think about, what method you're providing it to them. Is it going to be in print? Is it going to be on a mobile phone? Is it going to be on a recurring basis? And when you give it. The other one that I really want to highlight is empowerment. And this also sort of dovetails with what Sarah was talking about, right? That empowering people and making sure that the employees feel empathy for the consumer is really, really important and really key to effective intervention methods. And, you can do this by sharing stories, right, of successful interventions, or sharing stories about the impact of fraud, really helping the employee sort of see things from the consumer perspective in a way that maybe, they hadn't considered it before. Making it personal for them is also really important. And so there are different ways that you could do it. And again, right, having corporate support really goes a long way towards this, right? Because you can do things like make sure that employees are recognized for successful interventions. And when you recognize that, you're empowering employees to actually do more and to intercede more. And then the last I wanted to mention was delivery. And again, this just dovetails back to what Tara was saying, establishing effective escalation paths and providing support to the frontline employees when they have to intervene. Because as we've heard, from a lot of our committee members, these are really difficult conversations to have with consumers, especially when they're in the middle of a scam or in the middle of a fraud. And as our research committee, and I can talk about a little bit more later, has demonstrated that a lot of times consumers are, they're already an emotional mindset that they are not necessarily thinking as clearly. And so these are really difficult conversations to have. And sometimes, especially when you're talking about like the retail environment, that 16-year-old retail clerk may not be the right person to have that conversation with the consumer. So having sort of support for those employees, whether it's a dedicated team who's trained to have these kinds of conversations that they can escalate to, or even having mechanisms built into the transaction flow where they can stop a transaction and they're basically prohibited from moving forward and it's kind of out of the employee's hands, right? Providing that kind of support to employees really makes a difference, in addition to sort of the training that already has to happen.
Yeah, I as you're talking, I can think about people that I know in the industry who talk about how they have to sort of basically demonstrate their value in terms of like, look, this is doing good, but it's not just doing good, it's also improving our bottom line. It's sort of like, it's sort of helping that flow up, right? Of like, hey, you want to invest in this because this is helping everyone's outcome. You also triggered for me, we often talk about how big, the FTC has reports. Is it 137 billion? Is it what is the total that is lost to scams? What is the total for senior fraud? And to me, what always impacts me a lot more is not to think about that number, which is, it's way more than is in my couch cushion. So I struggle to sort of understand that number. It's to think about the person who went from having 400 and now they have 0. And what does their life look like now? And how will they never have a stress-free day again? And what does that do to them? And that's what really brings this home for me much more. And so, I hear that, and when you're talking about like help employees understand the impact of this, I think that's something that we often don't fully think through, like how ugly that really is on the back end unless you see it up close. And okay, not to move on that difficult point, but we have more committees to talk about. So research committee, the Scam Prevention Research Committee reviewed research particularly focused on fraud prevention messaging in order to better understand best practices and identify research gaps and questions that warrant further exploration. So what were some of the interesting findings there?
Yeah, I would say for me, actually, this committee was the most exciting in some ways because we really got to delve into things that as lawyers, we never really get to delve into. What they did was they really sort of took a survey of existing research, and what they found was there's actually not a ton. I mean, there is some research out there that we could draw on, but there's actually not as much as we hope. And so our hope is, really that people can take the great work that this committee did and sort of take it and move it forward. For people who are either academics looking to do research projects or either people who have funding who can fund research. That was really the hope. But the key takeaways, and I just found it fascinating, and I would love to delve into more, but the key takeaways that I think our research committee found was that opt-in bias is a real thing. So people just basically don't believe they're going to be scammed. They never think it's going to happen to them. And that can be a preventative, right, in terms of getting scam prevention messaging out to them, because they just don't think it's ever going to be applicable to them. The other thing that was really interesting was that scammers, as again, Tara already mentioned, scammers are really experts at creating like an elevated, heightened emotional response in consumers. So it disrupts the critical thinking that consumers normally apply to their everyday decisions. And when they're in that like heightened, emotional state, they just are not going to think things through in the same way. So it could be things like there's a limited time deal, your loved one's in trouble, the government's coming after you. Think about any sort of thing that's like worst case scenario, and scammers are really good at sort of disrupting that critical thinking. And then the last is that, interestingly enough, like consumers tend to forget scam prevention messaging pretty quickly. So there's what we call a decay effect, right? So, they hear the message, it may have registered, but it doesn't necessarily stick after a specified period of time. So our committee basically made some recommendations of what consumer education and outreach specialists should sort of think about, which was, as I said, incorporated into the consumer education guiding principles. But the things to think about are like make the message memorable and actionable, because those are the things that are going to stick a little bit more than the gloom and doom warning sort of messaging, especially when you take into account optimism bias. They also really recommended that you provide reminders because of the decay effect, right? So you have to repeat the consumer education messaging. They also recommended that it should be specific. The message needs to be specific in order for it to be memorable. So it could be things like educating on a specific scam type or educating on general tactics to avoid scams, right? So it has to be specific enough that it's going to actually stick. Again, similar to the consumer education group, they did find that you have to think about the community that you're trying to reach, because the messenger really makes a difference in terms of who they're going to listen to and what's actually going to resonate for them. And I think the other sort of recommendation was, in the moment warnings don't usually work. That's one of the things they actually found in the research. So if you are going to use in the moment warnings, think about how to optimize the design and the content for that specific, situation. So it could be things like, I'm trying to think, it's hard to come up with an example because I think this is a situation where the recommendation is there needs to be more research in this particular space to figure out what really makes sense. For older adults specifically, they did find that using positive messages works better than negative messages. So, things that will help you are things that you should keep in mind, right? Or things that are actionable, as I mentioned before, are going to resonate more than, messages that are saying something like something bad's going to happen to you or something terrible is going to happen to you. Like those messages just don't really stick and don't resonate. And then the last recommendation was obviously test your message. Test your message and make sure it actually works, because sometimes we think something's going to work and it maybe doesn't actually work with that particular audience.
I think
and there's
go ahead. Sorry.
Oh, sorry,
No, please.
I was going to say, there is also a whole list of recommendations for future research that I'm not going to cover in this particular discussion because it's way too long. So, but if anybody's interested in the guiding principles from either our education committee, our industry training committee, or this research document, it's all available on our Scams Against Older Adults website, which is ftc.gov/olderadult. And I can drop that into the chat or you can email that out.
Yep. I was going to mention ftc.gov/older adults too, so I'm glad you got it in. What I was going to say is that you, in a certain sense, you provided an interesting transition, I think, to the technology committee. So much of what we talk about is investor education, is teaching people. But at the end there, you were talking about how it has to be really actionable, and in a certain sense, that to me provides a nice transition to, what is this technology committee about? What are we talking about here?
Yeah, I get asked that a lot because there's very little information available publicly about our technology committee. So just going back again to the idea behind having these 4 different committees, we really saw it as, again, a holistic approach to trying to stop scams from affecting older adults. And while we know that consumer education, industry training, all these things are really important for intervention and for interventions and prevention, it's not the only way to do it. And a lot of times, especially what we learned from the research, is consumers may not be especially when they're in the midst of a scam, they may not be the best person to necessarily recognize that they're in the middle of a scam and be able to take steps to protect themselves. So the Technology and New Methods Committee, which is I think the official name, was really looking at how can industry do more to intercede when it does not require like a consumer action. So again, I'm really excited to hear some of the work that Mike mentioned at Edward Jones, because that's exactly the type of intervention mechanisms that we were thinking about when we created that particular committee. So that committee that work is still ongoing. So it's a little bit too soon to say sort of what's going to come out of it, but I can tell you, again, we have a lot of different industries that are involved. So we spent the first year really kind of learning from each other what the different intervention mechanisms that each industry is already sort of utilizing and applying in their specific spaces. And we have now sort of shifted gears and we've identified 4 different project areas that our committee members are working on right now. And it sort of follows along industry lines. So the first is really looking at intervention mechanisms that can, that a financial institution or a broker dealer or some sort of bank, I use the term very loosely, but that they can be using to sort of intercede and put some speed bumps in when there's a scam that's potentially happening. So that could be transaction holds, freezes, or other mechanisms that maybe we might be able to use to get the money back for consumers. And we identified this particular area because as I said, through our community work, we sort of learned all the great work that NASAA had already been doing on the broker-dealer side, but we realized there hadn't been as much developed on the depository sort of bank side. And so one of the things that we really want to do is sort of bring that up to sort of match the protections that are existing on the broker-dealer side. And so that group is like focusing on what already exists. Are there state laws that exist? Are there protections that exist? Because what we hear a lot from financial institutions is that they would like to do more, but they're prohibited based on various regulations. So it's really just trying to identify where we can sort of grease the wheel a little bit and do some more. So that's the first group. The second group is looking at gift cards, because gift card scams are, at least based on FTC reports, it is responsible for a significant portion of imposter scams. And so we are looking at what gift card industry could be doing more, and that's players throughout the gift card sort of ecosphere. So retailers, the integrators, the brand, the gift card brand companies, what can they each be doing in their respective spheres for best practices. The third project that we're looking at is an information sharing group. And what we did discover was that every industry is pretty siloed. There may be information sharing that happens within a particular industry segment, but there may not be as much sharing that happens cross industry. So that group is looking at whether or not there's ways that we could be promoting more information sharing between industry segments. And the last one is looking at text message, because as we can see from our FTC reports, Text message fraud is on the rise, and it's particularly affecting financial institutions, banks, brokers, broker-dealers, right? It's a lot of imposter scams that are happening on text message. So that group is really looking at, are there ways that those two industry segments can do more to collaborate together to stop those scams?
That's great. You know, I just have to say here, and we're running out of time, so we got to move to the last question, but I think it's great that you formed the committee. I think it's super important, you know, that as you study the scam space, that's like the worst phrasing in human history, but you know, you learn about international organized crime perpetrating these scams and assaulting the U.S. middle class and transferring wealth from them to, and you know, I think we're at a point where we can't hope to educate our way out of the problem. It's not that education isn't an important part of the solution, it is, but we can't, you know, it's not the only thing. And so I think this committee is great, and I hope I hope a lot continues to come out of it, since it's the one that doesn't have a final work product. But you know, that leads us into our last question as we come to the end here. You know, 3 of the 4 committees are finished. You know, what next? Will the Scams Against Older Adults advisory group live on?
The advisory group is going to live on as long as the tech committee is living on. So I think at this point, you know, it's a little too soon to kind of say what the final outcomes are going to be, since the tech committee is still doing its work. But yeah, but it's going to live on for a bit.
Makes perfect sense. Okay, well, thank you for talking to us about all of this. Thank you for sharing all of the work product. I see you put the the link in the Q&A. President McHenry and I want to thank everyone for attending today's Senior Issue Committee Presents Protecting Older Investors from Scams webcast. I hope the event sparks continued discussions on the importance of protecting our older adult population from investment fraud.